Hi, everyone. I'm in my mom always said, take care for the table you set, and I'm doing a little table setting now by giving you a sense of the run of show for this evening. It's Keynote. So tonight, CHCI board member and director of the Taft Center, Amy Lind, will be introducing Judith Butler. Following Judith's keynote, there will be time for a Q&A, and we're asking that you come up to one of the two mics at the front of the room to ask your questions. Judith will be moderating the Q&A. And then at the end of the event, we just ask that you stay seated for a moment so that Judith could depart the ballroom at the end of the event. So anyway, thank you. Now, Amy Lind, thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you, Stephen. Amy Lind, I just want to add, I'm professor of women's gender and sexuality studies and director of the Taft Research Center at the University of Cincinnati. In many ways, our keynote speaker this afternoon, Judith Butler, requires no introduction. And yet, in light of the theme of this conference, at risk, Judith's work over the years has been vital to our understandings of humanity itself, of the human, of life and death, and of what counts as grievable, worthy, or quote-unquote normal. Importantly, their work also offers us a way out, helping us imagine humane responses and forms of relationality in increasingly illiberal times and spaces. Judith Butler is Distinguished Professor in the Graduate School and formerly the Maxine Elliot Chair in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Program of Critical Theory at the University of California, Berkeley. They received their Ph.D. in philosophy from Yale University in 1984. Their books include, and I'm just mentioning a short list here, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, Bodies That Matter on the Discursive Limits of Sex, The Psychic Life of Power, Undoing Gender, Frames of War, When Is Life Grievable, Parting Ways, Jewishness and the Critique of Zionism, What World Is This? A Pandemic Phenomenology, and most recently, Who's Afraid of Gender? Their work spans philosophical fields that aren't always viewed as in conversation with each other. They've drawn from Hegel and German idealism, French post-structuralism, Adorno and the Frankfurt School, and Hannah Arendt, among many others. One of their earliest books, Gender Trouble, is read by scholars across the humanities and social sciences and is required reading in many courses and fields. It has been translated into multiple languages, catalyzing generative discussions about the possibilities and impossibilities of translating and re-signifying gender across linguistic and cultural borders. In the book, Judith argues that gender is a performative act that both reifies gender binaries, yet also offers us the possibility of re-signification. In this framework, saying is as important as doing. Throughout their writings, they argue that resistance to gender binaries and normalization must occur through the re-signification of those expressions, which, as performative acts, are and may also cease to be normative. It is no surprise that their work on gender is considered foundational to the field of queer studies and in inspiring the category of non-binary that is so commonly used today. Judith's later work reflects their ongoing commitment to intervening in key debates of our times, indeed in providing critiques, as we have discussed earlier today. Their book, Frames of War, When Is Life Grievable? And Parting Ways, Jewishness and the Critique of Zionism, published in 2009 and 2012, respectively, written well before the October 7th Hamas attack and the current genocide we are witnessing, took up questions of the painfully uneven grievability of life in ongoing processes of settler colonialism, segregation, partition, and the profiling of racialized others. Here, too, they offer us ways to think differently, including through resignifying notions of embodiment, vulnerability, and relationality, and in imagining identity and power otherwise. In addition to their publications, Judith has also played important leadership roles in the humanities and in activism. They served as a founding director with Martin Jay of the Critical Theory program at UC Berkeley. They received a Mellon Foundation grant to found and develop the International Consortium of Critical Theory Programs 2016 to 2020, where they now serve as co-chair of the board and editorial member of Critical Times. They have also been active in several human rights organizations, including the Center for Constitutional Rights and the Advisory Board of Jewish Voices for Peace. In so many ways, including this dates me, I recall Judith's presence at Cornell Society for the Humanities when I was a grad student there, and feel like in many ways I've grown up through my career with their work, which I now teach to my students in the US and in South America, and that has contributed to so many forms of transformation in students and scholars and activists' lives, and indeed influenced generations at this point of scholars. The title of today's talk is Academic Freedom in a Time of Destruction, Reconsidering Extra-Mural Speech. Please join me in welcoming Judith Butler to the podium.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. And thank you for arriving at the end of your busy day. I can only imagine how many thoughts you've already had. It's difficult to talk about a topic like academic freedom when its meaning is shifting in real time. But I thought to return to some basics and see what, if anything, still holds about our conventional understandings. Academic freedom is generally understood as a right that belongs to faculty members who work within academic institutions. It's guaranteed by conventions adopted by those institutions, which means that when conventions are violated or suspended, academic freedom is at risk of dissolving as a right. It exists only as long as the conventions by which it is defined are binding. The doctrines that lay out its precepts have no power to enact those principles. But if institutions adopt those doctrines, they are obligated to enact the conventions defined there. As the University of Pennsylvania American Association of University Professors has recently argued, and I quote, "Academic freedom is only as strong as the institution's procedures and professional norms that faculty members established over the last century to protect it," end quote. That seems true, but it is not the weight of history alone that guarantees its strength, since those conventions have to be enacted again to remain binding. Even if they are a thought from the past, that past comes alive in a present as conventions are defined and rearticulated in light of new circumstances and challenges. In the US, academic freedom has been defined and redefined by the American Association of University Professors, although there is First Amendment case law that has tested its meaning and contributed to its reformulation. The AAUP since 1940 defined academic freedom this way, quote, "Academic freedom is the freedom of A, teacher or researcher in higher education to investigate and discuss the issues in his or her academic field and to teach or publish findings without interference from political figures, boards of trustees, donors, or other entities." End quote. In general, academic freedom is distinguished from free speech, or more generally, freedom of expression, which we generally expect to be constitutionally protected in this country. First and foremost, academic freedom is a right that faculty have to design their own courses freely and to pursue their own research according to their expertise in certain fields, hence to exercise that freedom within a sphere of expertise, or, as some would rightly argue, in a critical relation to it, and to conduct both teaching and research free from the intervention of governments and donors. The first two forms of freedom are exercised in the making of curricula and the pursuit of research. The third is a freedom from external interference and, in some sense, privative. Apart from this formulation of academic freedom, however, another dimension of the doctrine relates to rights of extramural speech. Extramural speech takes place outside the walls of the classroom, and it secures the rights of faculty to express their viewpoints on any number of issues of common concern without fear of retaliation, including censorship, suspension, and termination. Today, I will be reflecting on how the consensus on rights to extramural speech has become increasingly unclear these days, and I hope to show how the definition of the extramural links faculty rights with students' rights of expression, even though student expression is not explicitly covered by principles of academic freedom. It is, however, covered by the commitment to expression and debate on campus that is part of the idea or mission of the university itself. I hope to show, or rather reiterate, how academic freedom makes no sense apart from the idea of the university, and in this sense, makes no sense apart from student rights of expression as well. In general, the extramural refers to a dimension of academic freedom not given as much attention as it should be. One can see by the etymology of the term that potential ambiguities abound. Extramural, outside the wall, but what constitutes the wall within the contemporary university or college? Is it a firm structure, a porous figure, a legal fiction? Does the wall designate space outside the classroom but still on the campus? Or does it designate space outside the campus, and so expression that takes place in a more generalized public sphere or specific jurisdictions adjacent to universities or including them? Where's the wall in the digital space of the classroom? And what about universities whose extension courses, called extramural curricula in the UK and elsewhere, confound the idea of the university as walled space? Conversely, prison universities, conceived as extension programs, are extramural and hemmed in by walls. Part of their aim, as many programs maintain, is to find an opening through and beyond the prison walls, even to prepare for a life after leaving them, and so are conceived as a passage. Depending, as it were, on the absence or presence of walls or the kind of boundary setting at issue, we cannot always tell what kind of expression belongs inside the classroom and domains of research and what belongs to extramural speech. In writing this paper, I wondered whether I would be rallying for a political cause, analyzing a contemporary situation, or even writing a publishable piece. I was thinking about the inside-outside distinction, but also riding that ambiguity to make my point. For the distinction between intramural and extramural to work, we assumed that the speech a faculty member utters in a classroom or research setting, or even an academic lecture, is distinct from speech uttered as a citizen in a non-academic space and for a more general public purpose. At the same time, we put pressure on this distinction, seeking to link the extramural more closely with academic work, which is all the more reason for understanding extramural expression as part of academic freedom. Indeed, many efforts are underway not only to link universities with the communities they serve and the communities who are clearly inside their walls as staff and students and teachers, but to show that universities not only serve the public good, but have a distinctive contribution to keeping democracies alive, especially when they are under threat or indeed at risk of dissolution. In a time when many of us are trying still to make the case for the importance of the humanities or the university itself for public life or for democracy, more ambitiously, we have to speak both as faculty within institutions and people who belong to a common world and seeking to participate in the charting of its course. In making public our scholarship, we participate in both domains, and we do so for the good of the university and the world more broadly. Our obligations are thus dual, intramural and extramural, and facilitating the reciprocal passage between them. Of course, the entire idea of the extramural is more stipulative than literal. One does not have to find a wall to distinguish between the freedom exercised by faculty in academic settings and the freedom of speech that takes place outside those settings. And yet, we would be foolish to discount the power of the figure. As a figure, the wall is transposable. It carries traces of both the city-state and the nation-state into the domain of the university that is supposed to be distinguished from the former, even protected from them. Indeed, we might say that the wall is decided or erected every time extramural speech is distinguished from academic speech. Its literal absence opens a contestation among various powers about where to find it and how to define it. Its literal presence does not always answer those questions. When we think of the distinction, we tend to imagine a legal authority deciding what kind of speech belongs where, whether it's protected, therefore drawing the line or building the wall. But let us remember that the extramuralists of Northern Ireland, for whom writing and etching on the walls of the city were ways of calling the legal jurisdiction of the British into question, no authority backed or protected their extramural speech. Of course, that notion of extramural is not the same as the one referenced by academic freedom, but is there no relation? A faculty member can speak against their own university, but in that case, they expect that their extramural speech will not be punishable. But the extramural walks a line, or maybe it's a way in which we all become aware of the line that we walk. In Northern Ireland, extramural has referred to images and pictures on the outside of the walls that call for the dismantling of the colonial regime. We find those in Palestine as well, where the No Walls movement transfigures the surface of the separation wall or apartheid wall as the occasion of its message. The art prefigures an opening that the surface seeks to foreclose. The extramural is one way of reflecting upon the wall itself, or proceeding without the assumption of enclosure. Consider the extramural studies efforts in Mumbai, where all students are outside the walls, where the educational setting is without walls, making extension teaching into the norm, into the definitional norm of the university. Or take the People's University set up recently in the Columbia University encampment in support of Palestine, where faculty, including our colleague Bruce Robbins from the English department, continued to teach his course on the history of atrocity in the encampment itself. Intramural, extramural, authorized, protected. Of course, universities do not always have literal walls that separate them from the cities or regions in which they exist, although some recall fortresses or the boundaries of nation states. Wendy Brown tells us that there are echoes of sovereignty in nearly any wall. The murus in Latin is a defensive stone wall meant to keep the enemy out, but also translated into English originally as a rampart. a term awash with military intonations of defense. Wendy Brown writes, and I quote, "Walls signify, inter alia, desires for containment and security, responding especially to the powers that declining political sovereignty has unleashed," end quote. And Brown advises us to think about boundary drawing and wall building as a defense against every kind of waning sovereignty, from subjects to states. The wall comes to symbolize a lost power at the same time that it defends against the realization of that loss. Her argument is that wall building is oddly ineffective, since the entity that seeks to be walled off is already saturated by the forces it seeks to keep at bay, including transnational migration, flows of capital, and the multiplication of non-sovereign powers, especially economic ones, that rival or defeat the sovereign claims of state power. In her view, wall building and boundary setting more generally are driven by a fantasy that seeks to resurrect political sovereignty under conditions in which transnational economic flows are, in fact, exercising greater power than the state itself. I take this kind of wall building to be a kind of fierce, if not furious, form of nostalgia that suppresses the complexity that has already undone the sovereignty at stake. Indeed, this kind of furious nostalgia in the face of an irreversible loss drives several restorative fantasies in contemporary authoritarian and fascist passions and movements. But today, I mean to ask, what relation does this account of walling have to the predicament of extramural speech in our time? Let me again return to basics. Rights to extramural speech depend on certain ideals of campus life, namely, as places where open debate on issues of common public concern can take place. These expressive spaces outside the classroom, but still on campus, are clearly part of the valued educational mission of higher education. And as we know, extramural speech can be regulated by time and space considerations, and sometimes those administrative procedures can effectively displace or suppress a gathering or a lecture. But are the rights to speech and assembly on campus still determined through recourse to rights and obligations pertaining to extramural speech? Or are the very conventions of academic freedom now threatened with dissolution by those who understand the administration of the university as a project of risk management? Can we understand the permission that so many administrators have given themselves to unleash police powers on those seeking to exercise rights of speech and assembly on campus as an example of a rationality that substitutes risk management for a commitment to academic freedom, including the protection of extramural speech? Those who embrace the neutrality principle for universities claim that extramural speech has to be curtailed to protect academic freedom. Those who speak that way forget that rights to extramural speech are part of academic freedom. It's not just that the distinction figured by walls change their locations and purposes, but that walling, recalling some histories of its defensive military past, becomes a new way of militarizing the campus when risk management experts decide that the costs are too high to allow certain kinds of expression, or the brand of the university will be tarnished, or donors and government funders will be driven away. The rationality that belongs to the very mission of the university is thus replaced by one that is concerned with calculating risk, importing litigation concerns, market values, and neoliberal concerns with cultural capital at the expense of educational ideals or the obligation to keep debates on campus open to matters of shared public concern. The defense of extramural speech is meant to ensure that faculty can opine on matters of public concern, that their knowledge can be useful for society, trusting that they will not suffer retaliation or reprisal for making an offering to public knowledge, even when it turns out to be profoundly, if not caustically, critical of the university and its financial structure and investments. But when the main questions become whether or not faculty speech, speech on campus, and public speech jeopardize or deplete the reputational value or standing of the university or offend donors, academic freedom is surely at risk. Speech loses its relation to freedom and rights and becomes a matter to be managed and regulated, if not fully suppressed. All this is well known, or should be. But I would suggest that what gets lost from view is that the fundamental rights associated with extramural speech form the basis of the claim that universities have something to offer the public world. Or even more strongly, extramural speech is the way that universities can both model and demand open and critical inquiry precisely on those occasions when democracy itself is at risk. When punishment and criminalization threaten public thinking on matters of shared concern, as Palestine and Gaza in particular surely are, then speech on Palestine becomes the litmus test for rights of expression central to democracy itself. I've turned to extramural speech, or the protections of it, because it everywhere presumes a notion of the campus as directly related to the idea of the university as serving, enacting, and rearticulating democratic ideals. A reformulation of the fundamental precepts of academic freedom for our time is urgent and necessary if we seek to demonstrate a living link, if not a covenant, between the task of the university and the prospects of democracy. The Canadian Association of University Teachers cite Matthew Finken and Robert Post, who argue in their text for the common good, Principles of American Academic Freedom, that extramural speech is, and I quote, the most theoretically problematic aspect of academic freedom, end quote. They claim that it, quote, implicates faculty expression that is not necessarily connected to academic expertise, nor to one's position within the institution, end quote. In other words, faculty untrained in certain areas are still free to opine about those areas or other areas outside the classroom without intervention or reprisal. The Canadian Association remarks, and here I quote again, it is linked to the general right of all citizens to express their views, but they do not exactly tell us what the link is. However, they concede that extramural speech is often confused, at least in the Canadian Charter, with the right to freedom of expression. Extramural academic freedom isn't just freedom of expression. It's a specific protection prohibiting universities and colleges from acting against academics for their political expression. That's an end quote. We may be tempted to say with Robert Post that, and I quote, freedom of extramural expression refers instead to speech made by faculty in their capacity as citizens, speech that is typically about matters of public concern and that is unrelated to either scholarly expertise or institutional affiliation, end quote. But did Post argue that only speech unrelated to expertise comes under that definition, or that any speech should qualify as long as it belongs to matters of public concern? If the former is the case, then extramural speech does not include those situations in which faculty members speak about their expertise in public in order to make that expertise more broadly useful to ongoing public debates. Indeed, one argument made against Stephen Salaita, who was denied a position at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana because of a series of tweets opposing the bombardment of Gaza in 2014, was the following. Well, let me put it this way. Pernicious critics, such as Professor Carrie Nelson from that same institution, who once held a leadership role in the American Association of University Professors, thought that Salaita should be removed from his faculty position or fail to be confirmed in a proposed one, because he had lost protections under extramural academic freedom provisions by speaking in public about his own research topics. His tweets were therefore treated as intramural because they were on the same topic, and the wall then was brutally drawn to lead to his loss of employment. The organization, the AAUP, to which we look for guidance, and certainly looked at that time, actually lessened protections for faculty and established precedents that have luckily been reversed by the current leadership of that organization. We're seeing now numerous academic institutions suffer defunding and loss of employment by virtue of the line, the wall, being etched in increasingly dangerous ways. The freedom to extramural speech serves as a protection against retaliation, or at least ideally. It's supposed to restrain administrators and universities from punishing faculty for their free speech, and it protects universities from the intrusive influence of external actors such as donors, states, or local authorities and funding organizations. It's generally not possible to distinguish a given speech act as extramural rather than just another instance of free speech. When speech becomes subject to a possible punishment or retaliation within the university, it is defined as extramural, which brings with it added protections. In other words, there's no specific kind of talk that is extramural talk. Talk becomes extramural when it is met with a possible or actual reprisal, as when, for instance, Minouche Shafik, the president of Columbia University, names in front of a congressional hearing the faculty she is willing to fire or suspend or punish. Or when Danny Shaw from CUNY is fired from his faculty position after 18 years of service after a vicious spate of online harassment, or Amin Hussein fired from NYU after being interrogated on his statements considered anti-Zionist, a case that shows the full damage of the overbroad IHRA definition that includes anti-Zionism as an instance, if not a paradigm, of anti-Semitism. Or just today, as a consequence of an alumni letter that garnered 6,000 signatories last November, Muhlenberg College terminated tenured professor Maura Finkelstein from her position in the Department of Anthropology for expressing what the college newspaper called pro-Palestinian sentiments. Full tenured professor in anthropology. Every time speech is threatened with censorship, or the speaker is suspended or threatened with termination because of expressions deemed politically controversial or unfit, the extramural protections are lost. Of course, there are always exceptions to this blanket protection. But when the exceptions start to proliferate or unfounded conjecture serves as a quick alibi for inviting the police onto campus to quell speech and assembly, then the protection becomes a joke, proving to be too easily honored in the breach or when no courage is required. At such moments, when the administrative obligation to protect speech and assembly are lost, so too is the link that universities claim to have to open public debates that are central to democracy. So it's important to remember that academic freedom extends beyond the right to conduct research, teaching according to academic conventions, which we know are changeable, and that it includes protections for those engaged in extramural speech from institutional retaliation. That retaliation or reprisal can be censorship or suspension, but it can also be bodily harm inflicted by police forces called in to undermine or destroy their exercise of basic constitutional rights. And when this happens, institutions are destroying the rights they are meant to protect, but also indirectly showing us why academic freedom in its extramural dimensions links the task of the university to democratic ideals. In other words, on university campuses, speech on matters of common concern, which includes political expression, is not just protected by the state as a First Amendment exercise, but by the university as well. The same utterance expressed by faculty has these two layers of protection, or should. The distinction between extramural and constitutional speech holds, but it is not a difference in kind. It may be that the same expression merits both forms of protections. We know, I presume, that extramural discussions are part of education on college campuses, not just restricted to speech outside the university. But are we always aware of what follows from this? If this is an educational good, debating matters of shared public concern, if this is an indispensable value of campus life, and students are a crucial part of those debates and discussions and expressions, well, it follows that they too should be offered similar kinds of protections against reprisal, suspension, termination, and police violence. They contribute to the essential value of the campus as a site of open debate on matters of critical common concern. A public debate or protest that includes both student and faculty voices may be protected against reprisal by academic freedom for tenure-line faculty and by constitutional protections for faculty and students alike if they are citizens. The overlap of academic freedom in its extramural dimension and constitutionally protected speech and assembly shows us the link between them without fully conflating the two. That crucial link, which shows how activities on campus overlap with democratic speech and assembly, is increasingly severed or ignored. And when it is, the relation of university debate and political expression to democratic freedoms is also lost from view. Michael Barabay recognized this threat in 2019 in an article published in Profession, which spent some time alternately admiring and rebuking a piece of mine. I'm getting used to it. And he on the same topic, and he writes, we need to realize that the foundations for academic freedom with regard to extramural speech and the very definition of extramural speech are shifting beneath our feet. That they are doing so in the midst of the crisis of liberal democracy is all the more reason for faculty members and graduate students to immerse themselves in the intellectual legacy of debates over the parameters of academic freedom, end quote. He was writing then under, let's hope, the first and only Trump regime, and was clearly alarmed by the threat to democracy at hand. He continues, now is the time to insist that the extramural speech of university professors is vitally important to the functioning of a free society, especially when it involves academic expertise in things like climate change, colonialism, race relations, gender and sexuality, ethnocentrism, poverty, medicine, technology, urban planning, ecology, and among many other things, theories of justice. Now is the time to insist that extramural speech is a vital aspect of academic freedom, precisely because the struggle for academic freedom is the struggle for democracy. Now, that was 2019. But that struggle, I would add, is not undertaken by faculty alone. For students, contributing to public debates on campus is part of the learning experience. Their participation in open debates with faculty constitutes the sense of the campus as a place where debate on matters of common concern can happen without interference, including police action or reprisal, including suspension and dismissal. Those debates are meaningful precisely because we assume that the entire community is entitled to contribute. To the extent that this ideal of campus debate is presupposed and furthered by academic freedom, it implies that students should have access to this kind of activity and that it is part of the general educational mission of the university that coincides with the exercise for what, at least in the US, we understand as a constitutional right. Open debate on campuses is thus part of the educational mission of the university. And universities regularly praise or even sell such open debate as value for students, and they consider it part of their own educational mission all the time. So though students do not have academic freedom, strictly speaking, they have rights of free speech that overlap with faculty rights or are presupposed by them. After all, faculty speak with students as part of campus debate, and campus debate is a right of academic freedom for faculty. Faculty could not exercise that right of academic freedom meaningfully if students were not part of the conversation, or, for that matter, unprotected adjuncts and staff. The rights of students are thus presupposed by the rights of faculty to the degree that participating in open campus discussions is a faculty right and a fundamental value of the university. If campus speech, debate, expression is considered valuable because of its potential or actual contribution to democracy, then why would it not be true for all those involved in campus discussion, that is, the entire community, including staff, to have such rights? When Barabé claims that academic freedom is the struggle for democracy, I wonder about the is in that sentence. It seems that academic freedom is a requirement if democracy is to be realized. But what then are the conditions of possibility for academic freedom, and can his idea of liberal democracy furnish an answer? Too often, debates on academic freedom assume a background of liberal democracy, but without noting the necessity of an enduring, reproducible infrastructure of the university. Can we have democratic principles without the material or institutional conditions that make them possible and effective? How do we understand the appeal to academic freedom in which such political and institutional structures are not in place? I've tried to write about this elsewhere, calling for a transnational doctrine of academic freedom that would be responsive to parts of the world in which academic institutions have been dismantled or violently destroyed, or where the appeal to free thought and inquiry as a fundamental right emerges inside the walls of prisons. Huma Hudfar, who was detained in Iran's Evin prison, made a plea at the 2017 Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences for academic freedom as a transnational right. And this was elaborated after she gave a series of seminars to the guards tasked with interrogating her in Evin prison about her research on women's issues, which was considered a threat to the state. As you may know, she committed her teachings to memory by drawing with her hand invisible lecture notes on the wall of her cell. Like the ultramuralists in Ireland, or those whose political graffiti now covers nearly every inch of the separation or apartheid wall in the West Bank, the structure that limits freedom becomes the occasion for its call. In the years since her release from prison, Hudfar has challenged academic communities to understand the crucial relation between academic freedom and authoritarian regimes, including regimes that are slowly but surely making their way towards authoritarianism through democratic structures. She objects to considering academic freedom exclusively as an individual right. She writes, and I quote, "It is now well established and accepted that academic freedom by its nature is a collective right. While we have worked to protect this right in various institutions, we have failed to define who is in this collective and what are the boundaries of this collective. Is it our institutions? Is it our national boundaries?" The AAUP is, of course, terribly important, but it is restricted to the US. Or is it a borderless and global right? That was 2017, and Hudfar was rightly concerned with active repression of academics in Iran and Turkey both, something that surely continues today. Although a human right, academic freedom does not belong to the individual as such, but rather to a collective of scholars and teachers whose contours are not fully known in advance. Joan Scott cautions against regarding academic freedom as a human right in her article, What Kind of Freedom is Academic Freedom?, even though her view does not differ radically from Hudfar's. Scott writes, "Academic freedom is historically a specific freedom that refers to the collective rights of those engaged in the dangerous pursuit of knowledge production, dangerous because it challenges established authority, whether of the sciences or the state. And yet," Scott adds, "academic freedom is not a human right. We may want to argue that human rights depend on academic freedom. We can do so only if we redefine human rights in terms of collective well-being, something better referred to as the common or public good, with the state no longer the sole representative of the public," end quote. Scott, of course, references the AAUP, a longstanding member of Committee A, but their protocols assume that existing institutions have adopted academic freedom as a central value, implying that there are social and institutional conditions in place for its exercise. So how would we appeal to academic freedom when those conventions have been destroyed or are otherwise absent? In Scott's view, there can be no public good without freedom of inquiry, and I fully agree. Further, the inquiry into what the public good ought to be is itself a public good. I agree. And if academic freedom is convention-bound, does it simply fall away when those conventions are destroyed or when the infrastructures supporting those conventions are no longer there, or when academic activity is targeted by the state as an internal enemy, or when the infrastructural life of academic institutions is partly or fully destroyed? The form of destruction at issue is not just the censorship or punishment of this or that faculty member, something we should all be absolutely concerned about, given the rise of new McCarthyism, apparently a contentious term on the left, but rather the dismantling and defunding of educational institutions and the physical destruction of all educational institutions, as we see now in the Israeli military destruction of Gaza's educational institutions. Now it seems we're contending not only with abrogations of academic freedom, but with the destruction of the conditions of possibility for any academic freedom at all, which includes the repression of students on campus, sometimes violent repression, and what the United Nations now refers to as scholasticide in Palestine. Scholasticide is, and I quote, the systemic obliteration of education through the arrest, detention, or killing of teachers, students, and staff, and the destruction of educational infrastructure, end quote. As of this date, over 80% of all educational institutions, including the Central Archives of Gaza, have been destroyed, including the killing of 95 professors, nearly 6,000 students, and 261 teachers of primary and secondary schools. At least another 7,819 students and 765 teachers have been injured. These United Nations statistics, furnished by the Special Procedures Unit of the Human Rights Council, document that 625,000 students have been deprived of their classrooms. The UN rightly notes that the human right to education has been violated, but also that the future itself has been destroyed. Quote, when schools are destroyed, so too are hopes and dreams, end quote. Professor Karma Nabulsi from Oxford University puts it this way, and I quote, the systematic destruction of Palestinian education by Israel counters a tradition of Palestinian learning and education that assumed critical importance in an occupied society in which freedom of thought posits possibilities, opens horizons. In clear contrast with the apartheid wall, the shackling checkpoints, and the choking prisons. Here the wall and the checkpoint barriers signify the closing of horizons, the arrest of mobility for Palestinians, and the antithesis to education as a movement beyond walled existence. Scholars Against War posts on its website the fundamental principle of Raphael Lemkin's definition of genocide, which includes, and I quote, the undermining of the fundamental basis of the social order, end quote, as a key military aim. Building on the legal precedents articulated by Lemkin, a Jewish Polish jurist, Nabulsi defines scholasticide as the effort to eliminate the role of education as part of that fundamental basis of society. Neither say exactly what the fundamental basis of society is, but Nabulsi makes clear that education provides a critical function in society, by which she means a way of imagining beyond and against existing limits. This critical function is fundamental to society. It is attacked when whole societies are attacked, when education is attacked in its entirety. In stark contrast to the conventionalist accounts of academic freedom that informed the important doctrines of the AAUP, in stark contrast to those formulated in 1940, democracy and citizenship cannot be assumed as the abiding context for the exercise of academic freedom. Education provides or can provide an opening to ideals that any future democracy should realize, a way of imagining against the boundaries that separate a population from the possible realization of collective self-determination or emancipation under conditions of siege, occupation, bombardment, and genocidal military aims and tactics. One of those ideals is free speech itself. Another is open inquiry conducted under conditions that rule out retaliation. Scholasticide, I think I got it, the killing off of educational institutions, is considered by Nabulsi to be a war waged against thought and imagination alike, or rather, the structural conditions that make that possible. Scholasticide, she writes, and I quote, is comprised of any of the following acts that entail systemic destruction in whole or in part of the educational life of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Killings and assassinations of university and school teachers, students, staff, and administrators. Causing bodily or mental harm to university and school teachers, students, staff, and administrators. Arresting, detaining, and incarcerating the same group. Systematic harassment, bullying, intimidation of the same group. Bombarding and demolishing educational institutions, destroying, looting of teaching and research resources, including libraries, archives, and laboratories, as well as facilities supporting the educational process, including playgrounds, sports fields, performance venues, cafeterias, and residence halls. Impeding the import of essential materials for rebuilding damaged schools and universities, obstructing the creation of new educational structures, besieging schools and universities and using them as barracks, logistics bases, operational headquarters, weapons and ammunition caches, detention and interrogation centers, closing educational institutions and or disrupting their daily operations, invading educational institutions, restricting faculty, student, staff access to them, denying education to political prisoners, including child detainees, hindering access to the internet, disrupting the provision of electricity, preventing free entry of educational supplies, including books, laboratory equipment, blocking the hiring of academic staff, denying them entry to their institutions through visa denial and other restrictions, revoking residency rights of students or academics who may pursue educational opportunities abroad, preventing scholarly exchange, disrupting international and domestic funding of educational institutions. Those are 18 elements of scholasticide. Not some, but all of these conditions have indeed occurred in the Israeli assault on Gaza, constituting a systemic attack on education itself, abrogating both the right to education as a human right and the destruction of cultural infrastructure, constituting what Nabulsi understands as the cultural modality of genocide, the cultural arm of genocide. This list cannot be described as so many violations of academic freedom, which in its conventionalist form assumes that they're already in place. My point is that academic freedom presumes a range of infrastructural conditions and adjacent overlapping forms of freedom that must be in place for its exercise. We know this in dire but less drastic ways from the de-departmentalization of ethnic studies programs, Africana studies, gender studies, the legislative attacks on their legitimacy, the censorship and explicit prohibitions of DEI programs and discourse. In some states, the attacks on critical race theory, quote unquote, since it's poorly and noxiously construed, and on so-called gender ideology, which we know does not exist. In effect, one cannot be in favor of academic freedom without calling for the infrastructural conditions that make it possible. But that call, right, the call for the infrastructural conditions is the incipient moment of academic freedom. It is pre-conventional, it is extra-conventional. There is no convention that is supporting that call. That call is for a set of conventions to be put in place. I've suggested that the very distinction between infra and extramural forms of speech depends on campuses and walls, the demarcation of localities that define the boundaries of the university, and walls that seek to separate one kind of speech from another. But if we're fighting to rebuild the educational institutions destroyed in Gaza, or even more locally, to reclaim the spaces that used to house eliminated departments or programs or student associations, or if we're fighting for the freedom to think, speak, and learn, then extramural speech takes place against and beyond the mural. And in places where no convention is in place to support academic freedom, the call for education is an extramural call that establishes or seeks to establish the possibility of educational conventions that would make academic freedom possible. So it's a kind of an incipient or inaugural moment, the extramural. It's not secondary or tertiary. Perhaps Joshua Clover is right when he said to Natasha Leonard of The Intercept, and I quote, that the extramural speech should be treated as something relevant to people's work situation, and that there's nothing extramural anymore. We're all at work 24 hours a day, wherever we are. I take it that Clover was not just saying that workloads are such that faculty are working all the time, 24/7, although I'm afraid that is true, especially in places like the UK or in state institutions, and for adjunct labor. But also the labor it takes to sustain, to rebuild, or build an institution is part of the work that we now do, and that is academic work, as is the call to rebuild universities in Gaza. Academic freedom, as it has been conventionally defined, presumes that extramural speech is the speech of citizens. But what if citizenship has been suspended in prisons? Or what if there never has been citizenship for the people of Gaza? What if calls for citizenship or political emancipation from systemic racism and genocide are the examples of extramural speech made by educators in the region in their effort to build sustaining institutions in which education can take place? That is the call to take down the wall that represents the bar on citizenship itself. It's a form of speech that demands to speak freely. It is an extra-conventional call for the right to education, what we might call extramural performativity. Okay, forgive me. The right to education is an explicit right that students have according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this abstract right is appealed to throughout Europe to defend against the deinstitutionalization. Of course, it's a non-binding right, but it is an ideal, and it's an ideal to which the European Union has committed itself. We may think of that kind of extra-legal entitlement as the rights that students have, unconnected to academic freedom as a faculty right and responsibility. But if, as the AAUP chapter at the University of Pennsylvania maintains, quote, the right of faculty members to freedom in extramural speech is speech on issues of general concern made as a member of the public, end quote, then students also ought to enjoy that same freedom, since the exercise of that freedom is a prerogative that belongs to the university campus community, even defining, we might say, its sense of belonging and its common aim. In any case, if, as I've said, extramural debate on campus is an essential part of the educational mission of a university, and debates and expression on controversial and painful issues are precisely those that campuses need to sponsor and protect, then we should ask what happens to both the right to education and to academic freedom when police are brought in not only to suppress a critical viewpoint, but to assault and arrest those who have exercised their right to expressive conduct on campuses. The police assault on students and faculty at UCLA, UNC, Dartmouth, Wisconsin, Michigan, Emory, Humboldt State, and a number of other campuses are authorized by administrators who are attacking essential elements of education itself, if not the kind of critical thought that upsets donors or rattles the sense of the status quo that some students have enjoyed at the expense of others. And I think we have to commend UC Berkeley for engaging in long and difficult conversations to avert this kind of outcome. I remember when I was about 19 years old. I had just gone to college, and I was hearing for the first time a comparison between Israel and the apartheid regime in South Africa. I was frankly appalled and could not imagine why my interlocutor, a Jewish graduate student who came from the same city, the same Zionist background that I did, could possibly hold such a view. I was just appalled. I was rattled and disturbed, and I had to decide whether I could even continue my conversation with him. His name was Max. My grandfather's name was Max. Why was he saying these things? As I was taught, Zionism was the view that the Jews needed sanctuary. And anyone who disagreed with such a view believed that the Jewish people should be exposed to destruction. So to be against Zionism, well, that would make me feel unsafe, or without sanctuary, or all the Jews in the world without sanctuary. It would be to reverse that history. I had a choice. I could have left that conversation and refused to hear what that very intelligent anthropologist had to say, or I could bear to listen and start reading in order to find or make a view of my own. I had to listen, as it were, against myself, against my own formation, knowing every step I took I was losing members of my family and my community. Even though open inquiry was part of that Jewish formation, as was the value of potentially endless disputation. I like that part. But then I began to read Palestinian histories, fiction philosophy, and to understand the state structure that privileged Jewish sovereignty and demographic advantage over equality. I came to understand the slaughter and massive dispossession of Palestinians that led to the founding of that state. And then I continued to read after that founding, and I concluded that no people can justifiably find sanctuary from displacement and statelessness by displacing and rendering stateless another people. And in this sense, I followed Hannah Arendt and Edward Said and studied both Palestinian and Jewish understandings of binationalism. I started to read in the history of colonialism. I looked for a non-racially stratified concept of citizenship in this country, Israel, which claimed to be the only democracy in the Middle East, and I could not find it. I didn't understand why there was no provision for people to live with equal rights within a governing power that they themselves had freely made. I understood and understand all these to be fundamental democratic principles, freedom, equality, universality even. I found that has never been honored by the state of Israel, whose present genocide against Palestinians goes against everything of ethical value that I learned from both Jewish ethics and democratic traditions. There are great Israelis, and there are some excellent movements there. Don't get me wrong. We're talking about the state. Many Jewish students are feeling unsafe, and they say so. But is it because they're being asked to understand that the Zionist beliefs they took to be commonly accepted are not shared, and that for many, Zionism is a version of Jewish supremacy, a form of racism? And when they hear that, of course, it radically upsets the beliefs and passions that constitute core dimensions of their very sense of self and safety, because that's the sense they're given through that formation, one that has been reproduced in different forms for many decades. That confrontation was hard for me, but it was necessary. My own views may well be wrong or in need of revision. Okay, let me know then. Rock my world. That is what I wanted from universities, by the way, and from informed interlocutors. Not because getting rocked is exciting in itself, no, because it was and remains the only way to have a critical look at deep-seated presuppositions, the kind that you feel you cannot live without, even if they turn out to contribute to injustice and inequality in this world. I would rather have inequality than not have that belief. Oh, really? Let's go back to the drawing board. If students have assumed a general national or international consensus on Zionism without any challenge, it is because those beliefs have been hegemonic. They have claimed a consensus. And the privileges that they have derived from that consensus have never been seriously challenged before. So something convulsive is happening. But there is no consensus now. And that does not mean that people are advocating harm or calling for anyone's death or even identifying with one political party or movement. They may, but that's certainly not a necessary implication, and I don't believe it's the general view. But it is a point of view, this critique of Zionism, this anti-Zionism, takes many different forms, and Zionism itself has many different historical versions, so there's some historical and conceptual refinement to be done in the common discourse. Let's hope we might have those discussions. But it's important for us to have this discussion about Palestine because it is one of the most important freedom struggles of our time. There's a value in becoming radically unsettled, not feeling safe with one's traditional assumptions. And that value is lost when we value safety over free and open security, or we invoke we value safety over, see, they've gotten into my mind. We value safety over free and open inquiry, right? Or we invoke security in order to quash freedom. It does not mean that one has to agree with what is said, but it does mean that one ought not to shut it down by weaponizing the charge of anti-Semitism, when we need that charge, and every charge against all kinds of racism, to remain tethered to evidence and the true conditions of their enunciation. The freedom to conduct a critical examination of such debates is what institutions should safeguard. And that also means critically attending to the institutions tasked with safeguarding that freedom. Educational institutions are obligated to bear criticism of their own conduct, including their investment in corporations that support apartheid and genocide. However paradoxical it may seem, they must also protect those who protest the university's investment policies as unjust. That is the obligation that follows both from academic freedom and constitutional freedom. And when administrators succumb to trustees, donors, or state powers that seek to suppress, punish, or assault those who are criticizing war, violence, legal counsel, risk managers, they fail both obligations, and the future of freedom in its multivalent modes is imperiled. At stake is not just freedom from reprisal, but also a freedom to imagine, one that requires future time or makes a demand on futurity from the situation in which it appears to be destroyed or replaced with the corrosive and endless beat of trauma. In some ways, the demand to rebuild the universities of Gaza is the right to walls that safeguard academic inquiry, that protect against intrusion and destruction, to secure the possibility of the future, that is, the future of freedom and of thought, a future without violence. Within Nabulsi's definition of scholasticide is included the idea of the destruction of the sense of the future that open inquiry implies. An inquiry cannot be open without a future that is open. Open inquiry is also one way to create that very sense of an open future. Opening the future is what Nabulsi identifies as fundamental to any society. Scholasticide is the murder of the future. The results of open inquiry are not always calculable, so freedom of inquiry is bound up with the value of the incalculable. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think I'm supposed to ask you, if there's time, to come up to these mics in front if you have questions to pose, and I will do my best to respond. What, you want to yell from the audience? No, okay. Give you a minute. Asli is brave. Oh, you're used to it, though.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciated the texture, the complexity you brought to the issues on the ground. At NYU, one of the things that kept happening during the past few months, and I am part of the student support group, is the weaponization, actually, of the students themselves against faculty members. So in addition to the donors and the administrators, one of the things that came up, and it was actually the introduction to your book, Wendy, about the walls, was that it was very one-sided and that it is a discrimination. So to the bias line, some of the reports that were being filed were on the grounds that, well, actually, Title VI accusations. So that's when other mechanisms come into play. And during the time over the last few months, one of the things that we have learned as faculty working with students and a group of lawyers was that actually First Amendment doesn't apply to private institutions. And the same thing comes with the spaces where NYU, the city and the public space and the university space are intertwined. And we have also learned that there is something called privately owned public spaces, which also puts more walls, I think, into, or maybe complicates more the extramural, intramural. And when my colleagues, because I was here in California, I wasn't there, on April 22nd, were actually arrested by NYPD. The allegation was trespassing.
Yes, of course.
So I was wondering how we can actually think about the boundaries of academic freedom in such a setting where actually, as you were mentioning, so many different definitions are crumbling, but also more walls are being erected as we speak. And administrators come with different kind of definitions and different kind of mechanisms. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think that you're raising a really important question, and you know, I'm not prepared to go too far with it right now, but I think that when and where a private institution decides that it's no longer honoring academic freedom, but it is to some degree privately owned, or that its property has been trespassed upon, it's drawing the wall in another way, and it's shrinking academic freedom in favor of expanding notions of property and territory and forms of sovereignty of that sort. At least at Columbia, my understanding is that they could only accuse a student of trespass by suspending the student or terminating the student's status as a student. So I found that to be, well, astonishingly violent, but also another way of drawing that line and saying you are not protected. So I think, in fact, even as we discuss the details of Gaza and we discuss the details of politics today, we should be finding ways collaboratively to understand the strategies that are being used to reduce the claim of academic freedom, and to devise, share some knowledge about strategies for overcoming that. And it will be important to pool that knowledge and to have that be part of our networks so that we're not just scandalized day after day. You know, and I think that that has happened already. I know that so many student groups are in touch with each other, discussing successful and unsuccessful divestment strategies, or temporarily successful ones, or at least moves along the way of divestment. And that's an important pooling of knowledge. I think we need to do the same thing with academic freedom. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that. And one of the things I particularly appreciated was the etymological materiality of your talk and connecting the extramural to the wall. And I wanted to ask about walls in relation to vulnerability, a topic that you've written about a lot and which I teach, and I'll be the subject of a graduate seminar I'm teaching in the fall. And I'm curious if walls are about protection nominally, what's their relation to vulnerability? Or do walls localize vulnerability, and do they name what's to be protected against? Because you talk about vulnerability in this possibility for alliances and solidarity. And I'm kind of curious if walls, by protecting and sort of denying us a type of vulnerability, if they work against that. So maybe if you wouldn't mind reflecting on that.
Yeah,
that would
thank
be great.
you. Would you like to come on? It's always hard to speak in front of my partner, who's an expert on walls, and No, let me say this. Maybe we could change it a little bit. I briefly did some readings in immunology where the notion of defense against a virus has been part of it's like a set of military metaphors that have been internal to immunology for some time. And there have been now challenges to that way of thinking, so that the question is not, how do we defend ourselves against an invasion, but rather how do we prepare ourselves for something unprecedented. It was a shift in a paradigmatic structure within immunology that happened among developmental biologists, which I found very interesting, and it was trying to understand being vulnerable to disease, not as an assault from an enemy, but as part of the porosity of the body and part of the ways in which bodies are defined as exposed always to elements over which we don't have full control and which can alternately feed us or hurt us, depending on what they are. I think that for a long time, the ideal of universities without walls, which I gather was an ideal that informed the founding of the Open University in the UK, or the ideal of getting into a university without walls from the perspective of a prison program, or of having education be somehow a way of getting beyond the wall even when one couldn't, is perhaps not just a call for the dismantling of walls, but also a call to make walls more porous. Like, what are the openings? What are the passages? What is the material out of which the wall is made? What is it? Is it porous? Is bodily integument a wall? Or is it, in fact, something that is responsive and transformed by virtue of its encounter with alterity? So I think the highly defensive notion of the wall, to defend against attack, it's unfortunate in the doctrine of academic freedom. But what makes it unfortunate is the fact that those attacks are real, and the possibility of undoing educational programs or educational institutions altogether is a real one. So how do we protect against internal interference? How do we protect against internal, external powers that seek to own or defund or destroy or manage, control educational activity? I think we have to put up that protection. There is a kind of safeguarding of what is valuable, which is not the same as a military defense. And I suppose that safeguarding is a term that I have preferred to use in my thinking about what is valuable, what is precious, what is vulnerable, which might be even related to sheltering, you know, the walls we need for sheltering, or that the unhoused need for sheltering. I'm not somebody who's actually against all walls. I mean, I'm not calling for the pulling down of all walls. I'm actually interested in how they work and how they get erected, and also how they change in their meaning and what they can make possible. So I suppose my answer to you is, what would walls be that would allow for academic freedom? What kind of wall would that be? Would that be a militarized wall, or would it be an anti-military wall? Would it be a demilitarized wall that would be a little bit closer to the idea of sanctuary that used to define post-dictatorial or post-fascist universities in Europe and in Latin America? Universities understood as sanctuaries from police power. So the line across which the police may not come seems like a different way of handling that. Anyway, I'm sorry I can't be more precise in response, but you got the best of my free association.
Thank you so much. I have a brief question, which is, I appreciated the ways that you spoke about academic freedom as pre-conventional. You used the word, it's an inaugural claim, it's an incipient claim. And as you were working that through, I was noting how the claim as pre-conventional can point into different grounds. It can be based, for example, on the common good or the public good. It could have other such underlying claims to it. My question is, in terms of political effectiveness, you know, when we are writing to our administrators and saying, we need you to protect academic freedom, it is the claim on which everything else stands. And this doctrine is one that you must believe in too, for this reason. Can you just tell us again, what is, in your view, that underlying reason? Leave it there. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, if I'm right, and I don't know if I'm right, because I've been trying to work this out for about 3 weeks, and you know, somebody could come along and rock my world and show me I'm totally wrong. But anyway, this is what I'm thinking is that, you know, in universities, we're always trying to say, but we serve the community, but we serve the public good, or we are essential to democracies. Those are 3 different kinds of claims. They might be interrelated or they may not. But I think that the reason we safeguard extramural speech when we do on campus or in the world more broadly, whether our faculty, students are tweeting, or whether they're collected on campus or protesting, or even in encampments, peaceable encampments, that they are responding to their world, they are thinking about that world, and they are taking action in relation to that world. And even though that's not the same as what happens in democratic life more broadly, it has democratic potentials and allegories in it. In a way, we're enacting key dimensions of democratic participation, debate, debate over values, what kind of world we want to live in, making demands, justifying our demands, and seeking to do that in a free way, safeguarded against reprisal or punishment or violence. So I do think of universities as enacting democratic principles through extramural speech, and also commenting on them and even calling for them. And that this makes them into a kind of experimental nexus for democracy. And when that gets shut down, then what prevails: censorship, police powers, the neoliberal university that understands itself as private or privatizing. We lose the democratic potential that extramural speech both exemplifies and calls for. And we need to continue to make that link between universities and democratic life, quite frankly, especially given that we have major leaders who are explicitly and shamelessly anti-democratic or seek to destroy democratic institutions once elected. So I guess I'm going to hold out for democracy as the way to go and freedom as the way to go. I think that's key because it also supports a lot of the other claims that we make, like why we should be funded and why you shouldn't shut down our programs and why you should listen to like what settler colonialism might actually mean rather than just say, oh, these people are using this word. No. Let's calm down. Okay, so that's my polemical answer to you. It seems like I had another one. The problem that I have with public good, and public good is really important to me, but it's possible to define the public good as the suppression of democracy, and when that starts happening, what recourse do we have? And I don't like the functionalist view. Harvard will, did I read this morning? Harvard will follow the Calvin report of the University of Chicago to a certain degree, proclaim neutrality about public issues, and center departmental and university discourse on core functions of the university. And that word function really caught me. It's like, oh, a functionalist approach to the university. It's, oh, we just do, we implement, we deliver, is that what we do? Is that all we do? Is that right? And even, Michael Roth, who used to be a conservative Straussian, is actually making strong value claims in the public sphere. I'm really pleased. Chris.
David, do you mind if I continue? Because it's sort of about extramural speech.
As you wish.
And my point is,
I just didn't see
the
it.
same subject, so I don't think it matters.
Oh, go ahead then.
But if you were first, go ahead.
So you said persuasively that the extramural is the incipient place of academic freedom. And the history of academic freedom in America bears you out because the Ross case at Stanford was the cause célèbre for academic freedom. And Ross was fired for two reasons. He offended the railroad companies, and so the administration there were afraid that Stanford would be hurt by his extramural speech, and because he engaged explicitly in political speech off campus. And those are the things that got him fired. And yet, that important moment tends to be forgotten. University administrators suppress that part of academic freedom and want to insist that it's only intramural. And it seems to me very important to remember this history, that academic freedom has historically been an extramural right.
Great, thank you. That's enormously important. I think there might be a distinction between the punishing of those who engage in political expression within an already established university, giving rise to the need for an academic freedom doctrine, and those who are calling for the right to education and the right for the kind of infrastructure that would allow for that more gentle safeguarding against punishment, right? A being safeguarded from punishment. But both are fundamentally about building different kinds of institutions and conventions for those purposes. So thank you, I really appreciate that. Chris, I think you're the last question.
Well, I mean, you did such an amazing job of movingly describing the appalling nature of these intersecting forces that I was having a hard time coming up with a coherent question. I don't know if I should thank you for that or not. But what I do want to thank you with is this, not only this, how long you've been at this battle against such opposition, but also the way that you model the possibility of thinking through these issues in a way that does allow people to imagine a much better future. So thank you for that. I was thinking partly in that state about a literary critic that oddly popped into my head, which was Paul de Man, both for having been on the wrong side of this, but also for insisting on something that I was hearing at some moments in your discussion of extramurality, and that is troping and positing as opposed to referentiality. And so the people are quite worried, and I think David pointed out the reason why this would be leaving the terrain of professional expertise and the exceptionality of professional status as won through this kind of knowledge and these long procedures, and seeing this as public acts of taking, say, an extramural right to speed and essentially positing its existence, and then having to have the political authority or the political power to make that last in institutions that are really top down and, bordering, well, just openly authoritarian at moments of crisis. So I'm just wondering if are you thinking of sort of a post-AAUP hybrid of democratic norms and professional expertise in which there's a kind of a different relationship between those two? That's the question.
Thank you, Chris. I think there probably is, in my own approach to things, of finding the trope and figuring out what that moment of positing might be. And I was partially trained in that zone. So overcoming one's own formation is not always easy, as I tried to say. So I appreciate that. I do think I would like to think more about what a post-conventional way of thinking academic freedom might be, and not just out of curiosity, but precisely because the issue comes up for so many who've lost those conventions or never had them, or they're being decimated. So I suppose I am asking for academic freedom not to be understood as an abstract right that doesn't require institutional support, but I'm also saying the call for institutional support has to be part of the establishment of academic freedom, and maybe that call is a kind of positing. It's not a call that just comes from a single person, it's a collective call. And I think it has to be transnational in nature, because it seems like what has happened in Turkey, or what has happened in Iran, or what has happened to Kharkiv University in Ukraine, most of the faculty are elsewhere now, and certainly what has happened in Gaza, but elsewhere as well. I mean, what Milei is threatening against Argentinian institutions is astonishing in the state of Arizona and the state of Texas. And we could go on and on. So I don't think, the AAUP is so important, not just for all the precedents it's established, and it's truly wonderful work in the last few years, just incredibly important, because it can appeal to conventions that universities have already signed. They're signatories of certain kinds of conventions. They belong to the AAUP. So it's important that that institution continue to be very strong in the US context, but it can't simply be transposed onto other areas of the world because the assumptions of citizenship and functioning universities are not there. So what would it mean to open that up? I would love to see that. And I don't mean to just, how would I say, provincialize the US model, so that we might think more broadly. And we thank you all very much for your kindness.